Alrighty. Alrighty, folks, we are going live here. I'm not sure if you're able to hear me just yet, but once you're able to see my screen here, it should, let me just get the right one there, say how to eat from the garden every day of the year. So folks, when you're able to hear me and see my screen saying how to eat from the garden every day of the year, let me know in the chat function and we'll start just kind of kicking into things here. So I'm just going to pull this up over here. All right, Jason is saying loud and clear on his end there. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Jason and Colleen, they've got it. I've already seen a whole bunch of hellos and conversation going on in there. So right on. I think we are all set here. Well, folks, we're going to go ahead and get kind of started straight away here. And I'm going to do a couple of housekeeping items before we begin diving in. And so the first piece is that as we go through our session here, if you have any questions related to what we're chatting about or just gardening questions, go ahead and type those into the chat function. I've got a really, really exciting announcement on that front that I'm going to share in just a minute or two, but know that lots of you will share kind of those questions amongst yourselves as well. And so just to make sure that everybody knows where the chat function is, go ahead and share in the chat function which happy hour number is this. Is this your first happy hour, your second, third, fourth, fifth? How many happy hours has everybody been on here for? Totally let us know if it's just your first one or if you've been on multiple here. And then the next piece is take a look at what Carissa was doing right there. Get yourself a drink. I've got the happy hour shirt on, whether that's a beer or a wine, cocktail, mocktail, water, tea, anything in between. Get yourself a drink and a snack, begin to kick back and relax. Let's start shifting out of being in kind of working and go, go, go mode into rest and relaxation. And that brings us to the third and final housekeeping piece is that if you're able to sit somewhere else to where you work over the course of the week, absolutely amazing. Again, we want to switch out of being in working mode, working brain, and into rest and relaxation because that is what gardening is all about. Okay, I can see in the chat function it's Kathy's first time. Jeff has been on a whole bunch. Lori, how are you doing on your first happy hour here? Great to have you. Amazing. Looks like lots of folks that are on their very first one. We have a lot of fun with these happy hours. And so to continue along here, because it looks like we know where the chat function is, I actually want to go ahead and pass it over to Carissa to let her do a quick introduction from her end.
Thank you so much for having me on the happy hour, Jordan. And thank you all for joining us today. My name is Carissa Kasper, and I'm the lead brand ambassador for West Coast Seeds and the founder of Seed and Nourish, where I create, coach, and care for kitchen gardens and their gardeners all across the Lower Mainland. And I'm here with you live from Vancouver, BC today. And my journey to gardening started 10 years ago when I was working for an Indigenous community garden project in my hometown. It was a very transitional point in my life. I was feeling directionless. I didn't have a lot of purpose and later became diagnosed with PTSD. And working in this community garden project alongside all of these other gardeners became a real source of healing for me. And what I saw amongst all the other gardeners that I was working with is the same feelings of healing, calm, connectedness that I was experiencing. So I believe in the transformative power of the kitchen garden to transform space into place, plants into nourishment, and loss into discovery. And Jordan, this is why I connected with you over the message of mindfulness in the garden, because this has really been the source of my own experience. And I'm so excited now to be working more closely with you as a brand ambassador for West Coast Seeds. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work, Jordan?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Carissa. And I still think back so fondly to the first happy hour that we hosted together where you ask the individuals in the community, what's the one word that they would use to describe what gardening means to them? And so I'd love to re-ask that question to everybody in the chat function here this evening. What's the one word for you that describes what gardening means to you? And as those begin to come through, I'm going to introduce myself for everybody in just a second, but one quick additional introduction is that in the chat function, you're going to see an individual by the name of Mandy. Mandy works over at West Coast Seeds, but we're also stealing a little bit of her time here at Mind and Soil to help moderate in that chat function and really answer the gardening specific questions. And so if you see Mandy in the chat function, please, please, please say hello to her. She's one of the most lovely individuals that you're going to come across and an absolute wealth of knowledge on the gardening front. So say hi to Mandy there. And then, Carissa, answer your question there. Folks, I'm Jordan from Mind and Soil, where we're looking to introduce 1 million individuals to mindful gardening. And so we're really helping to connect people to those mental health benefits. And those of you that have been gardening for multiple seasons, multiple years, I can imagine that a big part of why you're so excited for the springtime each and every season is because gardening is just around the corner. And we know how calming, how soothing, and the one word for me, restorative, the gardening is. But for those of you that are on the newer side to gardening, I know that it can be a little bit daunting, a little bit overwhelming. And so a huge part of our responsibility here at Mind and Soil is to be doing tons of free education like this to take as much of that guesswork out of gardening as possible. And so the one thing that I'd really encourage each of you to do right now is just below our video here, there's a little button that says subscribe, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel here because we put out 2 new gardening videos every single week to, again, kind of help take that guesswork out of gardening. And as soon as we wrap up this evening at 8 p.m., we've got a new video that's going live that I'm really, really excited about. And so to begin kind of diving into our conversation this evening, it's going to be a bit different from our past happy hours, where it's going to be a little bit more of working through a bit of a challenge that Carissa and I are really interested in. And so the backstory on that is that every single year, I set an environmental or sustainability goal. And so many, many moons ago, that meant no more coffee cups. I decided to cut that out. And I was curious what, kind of change that would have in my behavior, who I am. And when I would then show up to a cafe without my, kind of like permanent to-go cup, if I didn't have that with me, I didn't get to treat myself to a coffee. And so then the next year I added in no more plastic grocery bags. And likewise, if I showed up to that grocery store and forgot my kind of like cloth bag that I have here, that meant that I was taking off my jacket or taking off my sweater, tying it all up so that I could then, basically be using that as some sort of a bag in order to get out to the car. And then more recently, I decided to stop eating meat from big box stores and start only having that from kind of like more local, more ethical, smaller farms. And so as we were kind of coming into 2022, there was this one day that I went to the grocery store to buy a meal just for myself, and the grocery bill came out to $41.64. And so I'm not sure if this is just me, but I was a little bit shocked by that price tag. And so I'm curious to hear in the chat function if anybody else has noticed that the kind of price tags on the grocery bills are rising. And Carissa, I'm curious if you've noticed it or anything else along those lines.
I've definitely been noticing my grocery bill going up, and it's a little bit alarming to me. Something else that I've been noticing in the past couple of years is when I'm walking into the grocery store, a lot of the products that I'm looking for aren't there. And of course, we all remember back at the start of the pandemic, some of the entirely bare shelves that we experienced walking into the grocery stores. So, it's made me start thinking about, some of the gaps in the supply chain that we've been experiencing. So I'd love to hear in the chat for people to put 1 in the chat if that is something that they've experienced in the past couple of years.
Totally, yeah, and I can see a bunch of folks mentioning the grocery bills on their end have been hiking and climbing as well. And so for myself, that's also kind of, led me to start looking into, I guess, more local options. So rather than getting something shipped to a grocery store that's close by, starting to look into and explore more local options on my end. Carissa, what about yourself?
Yeah, I think that's something that I've really been committing more to, is getting to know my local farmers, because when those gaps have been experienced, they're the ones who are providing us with the food. So I'd love to hear in the chat function, who are your local farmers? And encourage you, if you can't think of one off the top of your head, to visit your local farmers market, sign up for a CSA, and get to know the local people around you who are growing food.
Absolutely. And one thing that I came across recently on that front is this business in the North Shore called Valley to Shore, where, to be able to drive all the way out to the valley to pick up your CSA box isn't necessarily feasible for everybody. And so what they do is they connect with a local farmer out in the Fraser Valley and then bring CSA boxes back to individuals on the North Shore. And I just thought that that was such a beautiful way of getting that fresh produce from a local environment or area to individuals kind of also living in that neck of the woods. And then I think the final piece there is that just over the course of the last few years, we've noticed such an influx on people beginning to garden. And there is absolutely, that mindful element to it, which is the be all end all for me. But I know that there's also that side of like, hey, if I'm going to be spending time out here and money out here, like I want some stuff coming from the garden as well. And so I'm curious, Carissa, if you've got any thoughts on that front, just in terms of new gardeners that you've noticed or observed getting into it over the course of the last few years.
We've definitely seen a huge influx of new gardeners at West Coast Seeds, which is so exciting. And, trying to work with fellows like you and all the other brand ambassadors to help these beginner gardeners learn some of these tips and tricks to be a little bit more successful is really exciting. And what I've really noticed working with clients and customers is just back to that initial thing that drew me to gardening is really how good it feels to garden. So again, I'd love to hear in the chat, when you walk into the garden, what is the first emotion that you feel? I'd love to hear for you to share it in the chat.
Love it. Love it. And so, as we kind of begin thinking through things here, there were all these factors that both you and I were observing over the course of the last several months. And so when I started thinking through what that 2022 sustainability goal could be for me, the idea came to mind, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on, Carissa, is can I actually eat from the garden 365 days of the year?
I love your energy, Jordan. And I think it's possible to eat something from the garden every day of the year, but it's going to take a lot of planning. Is this something that you're seriously considering?
Totally, yeah. And there's elements or parts to it that I feel like I've got under control, like some tomatoes in the middle of summer, I got that. But what do I do, or how do I carry out this challenge when I say go on a 2-week vacation somewhere international? How can I still have something with me from the garden on a trip like that so that I can be eating from the garden all 365 days of the year?
Well, I'm loving that image of you packing up your bag to go to Mexico or wherever and filling it full of produce and preserves so that you can continue eating from the garden.
You're not wrong about it being Mexico as well.
Okay. So, if you're serious about this, it is something I can help you with.
Amazing. I love it. Well, let's start diving into that. Where would we be getting started on it?
Well, the first place that I would urge you to adopt is this mantra, always be planting. So what that means is the first principle that I would have you think about is to be thinking in seasons. So in coastal BC, we are lucky enough that we can be growing food year round. So I like to chunk up the year of growing into 3 distinct seasons. So the first season is coming right up, and that's spring. We're all itching for it. Some of us may have already been getting dirty. prepping our beds to plant or planting seeds indoors to transplant. And the first big planting window is coming right up at the start of April, and even a few things that can be direct sown out now. And the stuff that's going to work best in spring are our cool weather crops. So that's things like our lettuces, our spinach, our arugula, our brassicas, our root crops like carrots and beets, and our peas. And we can, even get off and running even quicker by starting some of those indoors earlier. So our lettuces, our arugula, our brassicas can all be started indoors now or even earlier, so that we can plant out kind of come April 1st.
Amazing. And so I guess on that front, and when I've been thinking about this challenge, I was kind of thinking of it as like a start date of July 1st to kind of run July 1st until June 30th, 2023, those being the 365 days. But it sounds like what you have in mind there is that I can actually move that forward a little bit, that I'll be able to eat from the garden a little bit earlier than July 1st.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're transplanting out April 1st, things like your lettuces, your arugulas, your spinach, those are going to be ready to eat in 2 to 3 weeks. So you can be having your first harvest at the end of April. And those greens can be cut down to 1 inch from the soil, allowed to regrow, and you'll get 3 to 4 harvests off each plant, which means that you can be eating continuous salad bowls all throughout the spring and be getting started really early. And then what happens is you'll roll into those summer crops, which are the crops that people might be a little bit more familiar with. So your tomatoes, your cucumbers, you can do another round of your root crops, your beans, your squash, your pepper, all of these ones that we really think about when we think about the garden. And the benefit of kind of getting started with a big spring planting is it's going to stave off that itch that you have. And a mistake that I often see in beginners is we have a few nice warm days at the start of May. People go out, plant their tomatoes, and then we get a frost and things aren't doing so well. So it's going to stave off a little bit of that gardening itch, and then you can get those summer crops planted at the right time, which is the end of May, start of June. And you're actually just like flipping over the crops. So you've harvested, eaten most of what you've planted in the spring, and then you roll into those summer crops.
I love that. And, I think that, for myself in past seasons, it's kind of all been like culminating to like this July and August 1 or 2 big harvests. And I think to kind of expand as a gardener on my end, it's kind of diversifying that from like one big chunk to multiple harvests occurring for a greater number of months over the course of the year there.
That's exactly it. And you can take it one step further into that fall and winter season. So this planting season is a little bit different than the other two, where you're, instead of planting kind of over a concentrated 2-week period, you're planting actually over a 4-month period. So you can start at the end of July into August with your brassicas, which take a little bit longer to grow, plant your greens in August and September, and then finish up with your garlic and your broad beans in October. So you're spreading out the planting a little bit longer over this period, but this is a way that you're going to be getting harvests through those colder months.
Okay, super interesting. And one that I'm really curious to hear just a little bit more on is brassicas, because last year and in all past years, I've only done essentially like a spring summer crop of brassicas. And the challenge that I've found is that I start those in March, right around now. And then as they're like getting right to that like beautiful place, especially when they have like that small head that's starting to head up, and then there's like a really hot week, or like last year, a really hot month, and it then ends up bolting. And so what I'm gathering from what you're sharing there is that there might actually be an opportunity to start later in the year with those and to be harvesting as they hit maturity in the cooler fall months. Is that correct?
That's exactly it. And I've definitely shared that frustrating experience when I've tried to grow brassicas through the summer months is, you know, your head is forming and you go out and you're so excited, but it's pretty small. And you think, I'll wait a few days, I'll check in a week sort of thing. And then you go out and it's all bolted and gone to flower, and you've missed out on the harvest entirely. So there are some tips and techniques that you can use to, you know, make those happen through the summer, but I'm all about making things simple for yourself. So the way that I approach brassicas is I plant out a spring crop at the start of April, and that's ready to harvest at the end of June, start of July, just as it starts really heating up. And then I let my brassicas be for a little bit, and then I get my seedlings planted out end of July, start of August, to grow and mature either for harvest in the fall, or I choose overwintering varieties like sprouting broccoli or overwintering cauliflower that will actually go through the winter months and be ready to harvest in March, which for your particular challenge is going to be very beneficial because that tends to be kind of the hungry months when there's not a lot happening. We've kind of ran through our preserves and it's too early to start with our spring crops. So that might be a really good technique for you.
If you look right up there, those are all pickles. And like, I do not want to look at another pickle for the rest of the winter time here. Again, like past Jordan has been big chunks, big harvest here, big harvest there, and of the same things. But coming back, I guess, to like the brassica piece there, you know, that idea, is that what we call succession planting?
You could consider that succession planting, but more commonly, succession planting refers to planting the same crop out in 2 to 3 week increments. And the reason why you would succession plant and utilize that technique is it's going to help you space out your harvest, very important for your challenge. So your root crops like carrots and beets, it means that they're not going to mature at all the same time. So very helpful for crops that are direct sown outdoors. It also is going to help you elongate the harvest windows of seasonal crops. So things like your greens that we talked about, your arugula, your spinach, your lettuce, which tends to bolt really quickly in the summer. If we want to extend that a little bit longer into the summer, succession planting is going to help us with that. It also helps us to get more than one harvest of a crop out of the same space. So that's really helpful for those things like brassicas that have a long day to maturity. We can pull it out, leave it fallow for a little while, and then replant it.
Okay, got you on that front. Now, I think that part of the reason why I've had these like big chunks and harvest all at once is because I'm a little bit lazy. So what would I do from a succession planting perspective, now knowing that piece of information about me, Carissa?
Well, Jordan, I can relate with you there too. I think one of the important things for us to remember as well is why we came to the garden. So we heard from everybody in the chat how they feel when they step into the garden, what brought them to the garden, and it's all of these wonderful positive emotions of calmness, hope, peace. And what we don't want to do to ourselves is have the garden become a place of stress. So rather than us thinking all the time, you know, what do I need to be doing? I should be planting something. Instead, we're going to plant in those seasonal chunks. And then I have a few techniques how you can succession plant without succession planting. So one of the ways that I approach it is by choosing different varieties of the same crop that have different days to maturity. So you can see here, I have chosen leaf lettuce, such as our Easy Leaf blend, which is 35 days to maturity. And at the same time as I'm planting that out, I would choose a head lettuce like butter crunch, which is 67 days to maturity. So I'm planting them out at the same time, but I'm harvesting them in these successions. I really like using that technique for stuff like tomatoes, where we have early season tomatoes and late season varieties. So we plant them out at the same time, we're harvesting them at over greater window. You can do the same technique with early season potatoes, late season potatoes, and this is a pretty common thing that we can find amongst crops. So it really helps us if we're paying attention to days to maturity and choosing from each end of the range so that we're getting those successions.
I absolutely love that. And just like your depth of knowledge on the garden and the varieties, it's just like it's so incredible. And so like to contrast that with what my approach when it comes to varieties has been in the past, is that I'm thinking about like a variety purely from a flavor perspective. And what I'm hearing here is there's actually this amazing opportunity that, rather than growing just one variety, or growing it and starting seeds at different times throughout the years, throughout the years, that I could actually grow a couple of different varieties that have different lengths to when I'm going to be able to harvest them and enjoy them, but start them all at once to still kind of like check the box on the laziness side for myself.
That's exactly it. And you can take it one step further. So say you only have one variety of a certain crop, you can direct seed it outdoors at the same time as you transplant some that you've started indoors. And that's going to be another way of getting a succession. So that works really well for things like cucumber, squash, some of those greens that we talked about, kale, and that's a really good way to make it easy for yourself to succession plant. And another way that I approach it too for myself, if I'm feeling a little bit absent-minded, which I often am during garden season, is there's a lot going on. So what I do is I go out with my harvest basket and my pack of seeds when I'm going out to harvest things like my root crops. And I pull out a little patch of carrots that I'm going to eat that week, and I replant all of those spots with some new seeds. And that way it just kind of triggers my memory to continue to replant.
Amazing. Love that, love that, love that. And so I guess, what do we then do with those larger crops? Like when we take that brassica out, or those peas, or the garlic, if that's not succession planting, then what are we doing in those instances to not just leave that land kind of barren and empty for the remainder of the season?
That's a really good question, because some of those crops are a little bit harder to work with. And I'm going to call those transitional crops. So crops that have longer days to maturity, that go between seasons and don't really nicely fit into those seasonal chunks that we talked about. So how I would suggest working with those is to implement the principles of companion planting. So companion planting, just as a really quick definition, means planting two crops beside each other that like to grow beside each other. Or adversely, don't plant some crops that don't like growing next to each other. So one of the most useful companion plants in the garden are our legumes. So that's things like our peas, our beans, our broad beans. And the reason being is that they are nitrogen fixers. So as they grow, they form a symbiotic relationship with microbes in the soil, and they put nitrogen back into the soil. And that's very helpful for a lot of our hungry crops, like our tomatoes or squash or cucumbers, that take a lot of nitrogen to grow. So as my peas are growing up my trellis that I've planted out early in March or April, they're actually not going to produce harvest until June, July. So as they're finishing up, I've trained them on the trellis. I'll plant out my cucumbers like you see in the photo here and allow them to establish themselves, mature, and spill over the side of the raised bed before they start producing fruit. And then I'll just cut those peas at soil level once they're done producing, leave those roots to break down, decompose with all that nitrogen in them, and I'll just transfer the cucumber vines, which at that point are going to be quite large, onto the trellis to continue producing fruit. And the other...
You kind of take them from hanging over the bed in that instance to then up onto the trellis and tie them up or something along those lines.
Exactly. I'll just use some string or some garden ties and swap them out on that trellis structure.
So cool.
And then the other way that you can utilize those gaps so that they're not sitting empty throughout the season is by using them for our winter crops. So we talked about how we're having to start planting our brassicas out in July and August. So you could do the same thing with peas, cut them at soil level when they're done, create a little center spot to transplant your cabbage out, for example, to continue and grow in that nice nitrogen-rich environment.
Amazing. Love it. Well, should we begin transitioning here into a little bit of conversation on the soil side now?
Yeah, so when we're planting really intensively like that, it means that we're working the soil really hard. And Jordan, I know that you sell worm casting products, so I'm really curious to know from you, what is your process for keeping the soil productive?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to spend a couple minutes on that as we begin diving into that piece. It has been so wonderful seeing all the comments back and forth in the chat function there. Keep that going and we'll continue our conversation here. Carissa, thank you so much, even just for the beginning parts of this and all of your knowledge on that front. And, as we now think about the soil, it plays such a vital and integral role to us being able to harvest in those successive and ongoing manners. And so I really encourage everyone to begin adopting the philosophy of it not being a once per year, once per season thing that you do, but rather just as you're planting on a bit of an ongoing basis, we're beginning to take care of the soil on a more ongoing and throughout the season basis. And so to kind of like zoom out to 30,000 feet real quick, when we think about our plant babies, and I very intentionally call them plant babies because just like a little kiddo, we want them to be growing big and strong. And in order for them to grow big and strong, we need to be feeding them, we need to be nourishing them. And so resting down in the soil is of course where we're going to have all of our macronutrients like our NPK, all of the micronutrients that would be in there, but also tons and tons of biology. And so as the plants begin to grow, they're utilizing those nutrients that are down in the soil. And so they end up being these big and beautiful plants, as we were just seeing in the pictures from Carissa there. But simultaneously, that means that the soil can end up being a little bit depleted. And so it's very common, I find, for individuals to potentially establish a garden bed, be off to the races, and have an amazing first season, but then the second year, the third year, the fourth year begin to kind of taper off and dwindle away. And so what we want to be doing is having that more ongoing relationship with caring for and ultimately building our soil. And there's three really key elements that we want to keep in our mind as kind of the foundational pieces to our soil health. And those are compost, worm castings, and then organic fertilizer, starting with something general or all purpose, and then targeting more specifically as needed in kind of a more intermediate, means or way approach to gardening. And so the way that I encourage individuals to go about utilizing these three pieces is first beginning with the compost. And that is something that we want to be adding 1 to 2 inches of it basically right around now as we're leading into the springtime, as well as when we're ending in the fall time. That's just going to provide a really great kind of foundation level of both nutrients and biology into the soil for it to always be in really, really good shape. And we're doing that 1 to 2 inches across the entirety of the bed. Now, when we get to the point of transplanting and putting our plant babies into the garden, where we're wanting them to put on all of that growth, and when they've got kind of the warmth and the long days of spring and the summertime, it's at that time that we would then be utilizing our worm castings and organic fertilizer. And because these are much smaller in quantity, we want to apply these directly where it is that we're either sowing seeds or transplanting into. So if I were to be moving this pepper plant into the hole right here, once I have dug that hole, I'm going to sprinkle in 1 handful of worm castings. And then as soon as I've sprinkled in that 1 handful of worm castings, I'm going to come back with 1 tablespoon of an organic fertilizer, such as our 444 superfood. And that's just going to be a really, really great bump or boost in both the nutrients that the plant baby needs to grow big and strong, but then also all of the biology to be, kind of building that ecosystem. Because as we do this on an ongoing basis, what we begin to have happen is this beautiful ecosystem developing beneath the surface, where we can literally in this picture see those fungal highways going throughout the bed. And as a plant needs certain nutrients, they're able, kind of like an internet network, to go throughout the bed and grab the different macronutrients or micronutrients that that plant needs to grow big and strong. So as we add those layers of compost in each of these successive seasons, and I say seasons, not years, because again, it's happening multiple times over the course of 1 year, this ecosystem really begins to develop. And you get treated for that in the form of beautiful, amazing, delicious, and nutritious vegetables. So you're going to have beautiful heads of cabbage coming out of the garden. You're going to have amazing leafy greens coming out of there. And of course, delicious tomatoes. And so each of those 3 pictures are vegetables that I have harvested from my garden using only those 3 pieces that I just went through and discussed there. So it really is kind of like the foundational pieces that we want to have always going into the soil.
I've definitely seen the huge improvement in client gardens with the addition of worm castings. So I'm so excited that you're out there supplying people with this amazing amendment for their garden. I'm curious though, when we're talking about pulling out a crop like garlic mid-season, mid-summer, and replacing it right away with another crop, what would be your process in that instance? How would you go about it really quickly in 1 day?
For sure. And it's such a good and relevant question, because I've been at my house now. This is my 3rd season that I'm going into. And it was literally yesterday that I was kind of doing my spring preparations on the garlic crop. And this past winter was really tough. Like, we had probably 1.5 foot of snow on that bed for close to 2 months. And even because of that, I got it off of there. And at this point, I would have thought that the garlic would have been a little bit behind past years. They're actually looking a little bit further ahead of past years. And I attribute a lot of that to it's just growing in an environment that I've been working on and building for multiple years by adding in the compost, etc. And so those babies, they're going to get close to being finished in mid-July. So what are we doing in that instance to kind of answer your question? Well, so to use garlic as the example, our harvest date for that is going to be around July 20th. And so this process actually begins a couple weeks before that. And my encouragement on that front is to actually start that crop that's going to be following the garlic around July 1st. And even if it is a rooted vegetable like carrots or like beets, you can start those in little seed cells, and they can grow in that seed cell for about 14 to 21 days before needing to then be moved into the garden bed. So July 1st, I am starting those seeds and just allowing them to germinate and put on their early growth over those first 14 to 21 days. 21 days gets there, we're around July 20th, July 21st. It is one of my favorite days of the year, and that is garlic harvesting day. And so on the kind of 20th, 21st of July, I am starting that day by harvesting out all of the garlic. But now when we take a look at that garlic there, it's big, it's beautiful, it's lush. What that simultaneously means is that it has used a lot of the nutrition in the bed. And so I've got these seedlings, the beets, the carrots that I want to get in there that are 21 days in now. But before I transplant them, that's where we're going through our process of amending the bed with compost, with worm castings, and with an organic fertilizer like that 444 superfood. So each hole that I'm going around to, I'm once again adding 1 handful of worm castings and 1 tablespoon of 444 superfood. And that's already having gotten the 1 to 2 inches of compost in there. And so once I've done that, then I am transplanting in. Those right there are the beets that were around day 21 from this past summer. And by getting that bed amended, they had everything that they needed. So all that happened from there until the fall time was that they grew, and they grew beautifully. And so now in the fall time, I'm essentially flipping that process where I'm harvesting out the beets and the carrots, I'm amending that bed, and I'm getting my cloves of garlic put in to begin their cycle. And so that's 365 days of that bed being utilized and growing. And so with that harvesting that we're doing, in that instance, but also, Carissa, throughout the summer, there's going to be a lot of it because we've got amazing soil and we've got a really good plan to be kind of working each different little nook and cranny of our garden. And because we're going to have more coming out of the garden, we need to start thinking through, how do we go about preserving it? And so I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts on this front. How do we preserve this bounty so we can be having amazing things from the garden, even in those non-peak months?
That's definitely a challenge that I've come up against. Having large amounts coming out of the garden at once is really beneficial when you're canning. But for somebody like myself, who's, working in client gardens going full tilt throughout the summer, I find that I really don't have a ton of time to be preserving a lot through canning in the middle of the summer. Also, I'm in an apartment without AC, so it can get pretty hot canning in the summertime. So the way that I've started to approach it is I can the things that I know I love and will eat. And then I'm focusing a little bit more on storage crops and growing those to eat through the winter months. So storage crops can be things like root crops, and you're going to want to pick thick cord carrots like bolero, which store really well as things like beets, parsnips, turnips, potatoes. Storage crops can also be alliums. So we all know kind of the great shelf life that garlic and onions tend to have when stored properly, and we can create that ourselves out of our garden. And the third kind of storage crop category is going to be your pumpkins and winter squash. So your acorn, your spaghetti, your butternut, all of these ones are going to store really well under the proper conditions so that you can be eating them through those winter, fall, and winter months. What did you preserve this year, Jordan?
Amazing. And yeah, even before I dive into that, again, it's just like, it's so cool hearing you speak to not just carrots, but a specific variety of carrot. If your goal was to be eating more from the garden and for more months out of the garden, it's just like, it blows my mind, the amount of knowledge that you have on these fronts. And so for preserving from my end, there were 3 primary methods that I was kind of leaning into last year: drying, freezing, and canning. And I saw that Irene in the chat function there is doing some drying right now. And this is a great one to be doing with the herbs that you might have. And you can simply just kind of like tie those up, leave them on the wall, and allow them to begin to go through that drying process. But then for some of the other vegetables that we might have, such as tomatoes or fruits, berries, we can utilize a dehydrator to get a lot of that moisture out of them. And that's a process that's only going to take a couple of hours opposed to several weeks when we're air drying. And so, for myself, I even did some really amazing stuff with apples 2 seasons ago when I got like a little bit of like cinnamon, a little bit of brown sugar on them. And they ended up being absolutely delicious by just dehydrating them. So drying would be one additional way that we could go about preserving that bounty that we know is coming from the garden in 2022. My personal favorite method for preserving is actually freezing. And so there's kind of a couple of ways that we can go about doing this. There's a lot of stuff that we can just leave it completely raw. It doesn't even need to be blanched, doesn't need to be processed. We can just chop that up and get it into the freezer. Some of those include beets, carrots, rhubarb, but then we can also go down the path of actually processing some of them. So say our basil, you could turn that into a pesto. And then once you have it as a pesto, take an ice cream scoop and scoop a little like essentially pesto puck onto a cookie sheet and put that cookie sheet full of these, 12 to 15 pesto pucks into the freezer. They freeze, and then you can pop them off of the cookie sheet, put them all into a plastic bag or something like that, some kind of storage unit in the freezer. And then as you want to have a pesto, you just grab one pesto puck and you're all set and ready to go. We could also be doing some berries, turning those into jams. And then all the scraps that we have as we go through these kind of larger processing days, we can freeze all those and then boil them down into a vegetable stock at some point through those cold winter months. And the kind of biggest tip that I have on this front for folks is similar to the pesto, even the stuff that we have raw, like those beets, carrots, and rhubarb, as we see in the picture here, is to chop them up into small pieces and go ahead and flash freeze them. So spread them out on something like a cookie sheet, put them into the freezer for an hour, hour and a half, and then put them into individual storage kind of units or bags. And then that way, when you want to have some roasted vegetables, you can really quickly and easily just grab one handful of carrots, one handful of beets, and be off to the races in the kitchen there. And then the last method was that I started running out of space in my freezer. And so I need to think through how else can I be preserving these things? And that's where I turned to canning. And so there's lots and lots of amazing stuff that we can ultimately get canned away. Something like cabbage. I had like 6 heads of cabbage that came out all at once. Again, last year was a year of chunk harvests for Jordan. And then say with our tomatoes, I turned a lot of those into pasta sauces. And then as I've alluded to already here, the cucumbers, I pickled those. So have those all living as canned pickles through the winter here, and berries turned into jams as well. And the biggest learning that I kind of gained from last season was that I was trialing my recipes on my harvest, on my bounty. And there's a couple of those recipes that I don't really like all that much. And so it's like such a shame that I grew these beautiful vegetables, but then have a recipe that I hadn't trialed before. And so my encouragement to everybody is, as we go into the season right now, spend some time, buying cucumbers from the store or buying tomatoes from the store, pickling them or making a pasta sauce and figuring out which recipes you like the most so that you can apply those learnings to the beautiful harvest that you have coming out of the garden in just a few months. So trial the recipes there is kind of the takeaway.
That's really honestly such a great tip, because I'm not joking. I spent 6 seasons perfecting the pickled carrot recipe that I now use, trying to get to, what I remembered as my high school friend's dad's recipe, but also wanting to do it safely. So I didn't want to tweak the recipes as I was going, because that can lead to all sorts of, issues with your canning. You have to stick to the recipes, right? But finding the right one is such a good idea to do beforehand, before you've committed to 24 jars of something that you don't like. And I'm seeing in the chat so many great suggestions from people of how to preserve your harvest.
I know. I wish right now that I was just like a member being able to just be reading through the chat function, because I can see it going real fast, and I'm sure that there's some biggest things coming through there.
I'm going to definitely be diving through after this and writing them down. So thank you everybody for sharing all of your great recipes. Jordan, something that I've done, through my learning experiences, I've stopped canning tomatoes altogether, because I just found I had to take so many of my tomatoes, which I wanted to eat through the summertime, and boil them down to such a small amount of puree and then an even smaller amount of sauce, how I was wanting to use it. And, I just thought, I'm giving up on this. Is canning tomatoes worth it for you?
Yeah, so let's go back to the very beginning of our conversation. and getting to know those local farmers, those individuals that are growing larger quantities in your area. So last year, I had a great amount of tomatoes coming out of the garden, but canning, it's also more effort. And so rather than just doing maybe 3 or 4 pints of tomato sauce, what I actually did is that I've got some friends, they own a farm, and at that point in the summertime, they had a huge abundance of tomatoes, too much that they would be able to sell. And so they were able to bring me multiple big boxes of tomatoes. And then I was making like a huge pot worth of tomato sauce. And so my encouragement to individuals on this front is to actually go down that path of potentially supplementing your harvest with things that you can get from your local farmers, because it's kind of like a really beautiful symbiotic relationship where they're going to have an abundance of things. You're able to get that to be eating more fresh and more local produce, and then simultaneously be supporting them with the kind of excess crops that they have. I'm curious if you've got any thoughts on that as well there, Carissa.
I think that's definitely a good approach because, we can grow a lot using all of these techniques for, high density planting and harvesting and year-round harvesting from our backyard gardens. But, most backyard gardens aren't going to be able to produce everything we need for an entire year. So, frequenting those local farms, getting the amounts that you need to do big batches of canning, that makes a lot more sense to me, and definitely a good approach to take. So do you have anything that you'll be supplementing this upcoming year? Or
Yeah, so I'll definitely be doing more of the tomatoes. One thing that I will not be supplementing with are the cucumbers, because last year with it being so nice and warm, I had way too many of them, still have a whole bunch. And so at this point in the year and in the winter, kind of as I alluded to earlier, Carissa, I don't know if I can eat another pickle for the life of me. And so I'm curious, as we think about this challenge, and it's now January, February of 2023, are there other ways that I could go about eating from the garden through the wintertime?
yeah, we talked about getting that winter garden going. So that mainly means your brassicas. But what ends up happening with those winter crops is they're going to grow a lot through the summer and the fall. But once they get into the winter, our daylight hours decrease to the point where plants just really aren't putting on any new growth. So basically the winter garden holds our crops in place. So we can harvest all of the growth that was produced through the fall, but once it's kind of done, you're not really going to get more that'll carry you through the winter. So I think really through those winter months, once you get into January, February, really, where you're going to have to turn is the indoor garden. So things like microgreens, sprouts, those cut and come again greens we talked about, annual herbs like cilantro and parsley. But to be honest, by the time I get to the end of fall, I'm very tired and I don't really want to be growing indoors through the winter. So I don't have a lot of experience with indoor gardening. Is this something that you've dabbled in?
Yeah, and I can first, I love that idea of the garden being a holding space for vegetables through the wintertime. And it is such a joy to find that extra carrot or that extra beet that you didn't get during the harvest. And for myself, I can also really relate to just that exhaustion at the end of the gardening season where it's like, whew, I want a little bit of downtime. And I know that that's going to be an edge of this challenge. And I do want to go down that path of beginning to do some microgreens and sprouts. But to that end, I haven't done it before. And so I wouldn't feel comfortable being on this happy hour here and chatting about this is exactly how to go about growing microgreens or sprouts. But rather, I think what would be really kind of helpful or useful to go through is when you or myself are looking to expand as a gardener and to kind of elevate our gardening game or bring new elements into it, how do we go about doing that? And so I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the ways that you look to kind of expand your gardening practice?
I mean, the first place that I turn is to my community. That's where I learned to garden. I was learning as at the same time as I was teaching, which, one of the quickest ways to learn. And there's just such a wealth of knowledge out there amongst members of the community. I find gardening to be just such a fascinating field because the knowledge exists within individuals rather than institutions. So, turning to a family member, your grandma, your mother who has an amazing garden, signing up for a community garden and, picking the brain of people who have been gardening there for 5, 10, 20 years, to me is one of the both most rewarding because you're in connection with people and quickest ways to learn. Where do you start when you're trying to learn something new in the garden?
Yeah, totally. And just to echo that, it's one of my favorite parts of the gardening world is just that sense of community and how welcoming everybody is. And we can see it in the chat function here tonight where it's talking about what temperature did you do this at? What did you do that with that? And just that knowledge share that begins to occur in there. And that's a huge part of why we wanted to get Mandy, kind of like a permanent spot here in the chat. So folks, as we begin kind of getting towards the tail end of this presentation here, I would absolutely love it if you gave a big thank you to Mandy for all the questions that she has answered in the chat function over the course of our hour and all that knowledge that she's shared with everybody this evening. And so continuing along for myself, the place that I have gone and essentially developed my entire gardening practice off of is YouTube. And I absolutely love YouTube. It's a huge part of why I just get so much joy out of building our YouTube channel now and getting to kind of like add to that overall mind share of everything that's out there, because a lot of stuff has been done, but a lot of stuff has not been done. And we still know so little about that soil ecosystem, that whole world in there. And so a couple of my favorite accounts out there are Epic Gardening, Kevin and the team down in California, and then Sir Charles Dowding over in the UK. If you're looking to just like zen out for an evening and you're looking to have like a real mellow time, throw on some Charles Dowding, listen to like his soft, gentle British accent, and it is just divine. So those are a couple of my favorite ways. Carissa, any others on your end?
Yeah, I have a degree in creative writing and I'm a big reader. So definitely I go to books to learn. So for beginner gardeners, the square foot gardening method is a really great foundation to learn how to grow a lot in a small space, especially if you're growing in raised bed gardens. And then I feel so fortunate to have just a huge wealth of collective knowledge working with West Coast Seeds and all of that being poured into resources to help gardeners grow. So I'm consulting their companion planting guide every time I'm putting together a garden plan. I use their planting charts, their 2022 gardening guide. All of that is just full of knowledge and resources, as well as the online blog for pretty much anything you'd like to know.
Yeah, absolutely. And that companion planting guide that you just alluded to, I'm not going to lie, folks, like that is my favorite West Coast Seeds resource. And so I've got a couple of pages of it pulled up right here, but like literally you can go through it, look up any vegetable that you're looking to grow, and it's going to show you in green, these vegetables grow well alongside it. And in red, keep this one away, they do not grow well together. So that companion planting guide, I know that a lot of folks talk about the planting chart and what you can be planting at the different times of the year. This is like the dark horse best resource from West Coast Seeds. I'm not going to lie. And then one that I'm going to be utilizing this coming season is that growing sprouts and microgreens guide that also exists up there. So Carissa, I think when you and I started this process of beginning to even just discuss how to eat from the garden every day year, I was definitely feeling overwhelmed. And we were going to wrap up by feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling excited now from the conversations that we've had, and really just like the wealth of knowledge that you've brought to the table in our conversations that we've had over the last kind of 6 weeks as we've built this kind of happy hour out here. And so if I was an individual in the community and wanted to either be eating from the garden every day of the year, or even just going in that path of beginning to get more and more produce, bounty, and yield from the garden, what would that look like with you?
So I offer $99 consultations. So if you are wanting to set up a garden or kind of level up your garden space after having a little bit of success and fun in previous years, I can come to your site in the Lower Mainland. We'll do an on-site site assessment, have a discussion kind of about style and what appeals to you. And you'll walk away with a design sketch and concept board that you can either take on your way and do on your own, or enlist me to help you with the installation process. And I also offer, if you have your garden in place and you're just looking for a little bit more planning help, I offer a garden coaching service. So same thing, $99. I come on site. We dive deep into a particular question or questions that you have and get you kind of set up so that you're prepped for some success. And if you're looking for kind of that one step further so that you have a plan for the whole season, I can take that with you and put together a plan for you as well. And I wanted to offer all of the community members here today 50% off those consultations with the code transformation. So you can head to my website, book your session, and be on your way. For those people who, might be feeling like pretty good about their planning, they've got their garden in place, but they're wanting to ensure that it stays productive year after year. What are you able to offer people for that, Jordan?
Yeah, absolutely. So from our end, a lot of folks have been utilizing our worm casting seedling mix over the course of the last, kind of month or so. And as we start kind of gearing up for the garden, getting it ready, getting those soils in place, that's where we have our transplant kit. And that has literally the elements that we were showcasing earlier there, the worm castings and the 444 superfood. So our backyard size, which comes with 3 bags of worm castings and 1 bag of the 444 superfood, we are offering free shipping on that all across Canada. We'll be shipping these all out beginning of next week, so you'll have them in time for transplanting. And if you want to purchase that, the link to do so is just down in the description of this video, as is Carissa's website. So all the links just below the video here are right down there if you wanted to place your order. And this is something that we have had individuals in our community utilizing over the course of the last year. So this isn't something that just myself or just Carissa have had luck with. We take a look at Bonnie here, and her patch of tomatoes there were just absolutely out of control. And that was her first year of gardening. And so this stuff works absolutely amazing when it comes to transplanting, and then again, feeding the soil over the course of the season. And the other side to that is that, full confession, I have not started any of my seeds yet for this upcoming season. And I actually like to be on the late side of starting my seeds, just to kind of show everyone that, you don't need to be starting these in February or on March 1st. And so if any of you have not started your seeds yet, then we also are doing free shipping all across Canada on our worm casting seedling mix. I'm going to be starting all of my seeds next weekend. And so we're going to be shipping this out over the course of this week, which would mean that you'd be starting your seeds kind of in and around the exact same time as me. And the link for that is in the description as well. We'll email all that out afterwards here. But folks, I would love to now just kind of open it up to a little bit of Q&A in case anybody has a couple of questions for Carissa and myself. If you have questions, go ahead and kind of type those into the chat function there, and we'll hang around for maybe kind of 5 minutes or so to answer a couple of those questions. And so I can see from Maureen there, I love Jordan's worm castings. Thank you so much, Maureen. You're so wonderful. And then right below that, Annette, how do we order the worm castings? So Annette, in the video here, or in the YouTube player, just directly below the video, there are links to that transplant kit, as well as the worm casting seedling mix. So you start your seeds in the worm casting seedling mix, get them surrounded by all that nutrients and all the microbes early on. and then you utilize the transplant kit to transplant them when it gets just a little bit warmer out there. Okay, amazing question from Karen here. And I think I'm gonna throw this one over to Carissa because we chatted about what I believe you utilize on your end. Karen asked, Jordan, what is a good home worm system? So Carissa, any thoughts on that? Any preferences from your end?
I'm pretty sold on one system. It's called the Hungry Bin. And I have two of them myself, and I've set up a ton of clients with them in the last couple of years. And the reason I really like this system is it's divided into sections in kind of a bit of a funnel shape. So the worm castings sink to the bottom, you unclip the tray when you're ready to harvest, and just your worm castings are coming out. Your worms are still at the top level, all of the food that you're putting in is at the top, so you don't have to do all of the sifting, sorting, etc., which can be pretty messy business. You just unclip it and harvest your castings that way. And I've found a lot of good success with that method.
Love it. And I'll actually answer a different part of that question, or just a completely different question that I'm just making up in my head because I like talking about worms. And so, Karen, one thing that I've found over the years of worm farming is that when it comes to the bedding that's utilized, it's very common to utilize like paper or cardboard. What I've actually really, really loved is utilizing a partially finished compost. So if you have some compost that's kind of like 50, 75% done, using that as the bedding and then putting your food, your kitchen scraps in there and kind of covering them underneath, because it's kind of like a built-in set of bedding, but also a built-in nutrition source. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility on when exactly you're feeding them. So those are a couple of thoughts there. Question from Butterfly, what breed are your worms? Red Wigglers, absolutely. And I saw this question from Claude here that was directed to Mandy, but I'm going to also ask it over to Carissa. So Claude asked, what do you recommend for crops in containers?
A lot of crops can be grown in containers, but it comes down to varieties and size of containers. So what I'd recommend, Claude, is we have an urban gardening series with West Coast Seeds that dials into the specifics of that. So I'd recommend you to sign up for that, and you're going to get kind of a deep dive into container growing, which is going to be really helpful. I'm also seeing a question from Storm by Design about transitioning into a square foot garden. You have very massive beds, they're 40-foot long. So what I tend to do with that is just set up pathways so that you have basically chunks of garden. It depends on what the width of the garden is, but you could chunk it up into kind of like 4x4 sections, or you can chunk it up into kind of long in-ground raised beds with wide that are no more than 2 to 3 feet wide, with big pathways in between, and you're going to mulch those pathways. So you're decreasing the footprint, making sure that you have access to the crops by reaching in at all points, because you won't have access by walking between rows anymore. So basically you're looking for 4 feet widths or under so that you can access those crops.
Beautiful. Love it. I think we've gotten to pretty much all the questions here, at least that I can see. Folks, if we have not answered any of your questions, you can leave any question at any point throughout the gardening season on any of our YouTube videos on our channel here. And I start my day by answering every single question that we get on YouTube. So just drop them as a comment on any of our videos, and you'll probably have an answer from me within 24 hours, unless it is on a Saturday when you ask it, because Sundays, I do give myself a little bit of a break on those days. Carissa, one last question that came through. Do you do virtual consultations and coachings for individuals that would not be in the Lower Mainland?
Yeah, absolutely. The community garden that and my hometown is in Saskatchewan, and my mom and sister are in Edmonton. So I do have experience with those colder regions as well. So absolutely happy to help you in other places too.
Amazing. Well, we will get a whole bunch of goodies emailed out to everybody here, including Carissa's website there, so that you can grab some time with her. Saw the same question that just came through from Colin about that. So hopefully it was caught there. And so that is everything for this evening here, folks. Wanted to just give a huge shout out to the team behind the scenes, Mandy and Mike in the chat function there, Jason over at West Coast Seeds for getting the invites out to everybody. And of course, Carissa, to you for all of your knowledge that you shared with us this evening. Thank you so much for it.
Thank you for having me, Jordan, and thank you everybody for being here with us.
All righty, folks, that's all for now, and we'll catch you on the next one. Have a great evening, everybody.